Eric Rhoads is the publisher of Radio Inc. and chairman of Streamline Publishing, and the most knowledgeable and influential journalist in support of our industry. He began his radio career in 1968 as an announcer, and since has owned radio stations, not to mention support companies for the industry. He purchased a small radio magazine in the 80s and soon after changed his name to Radio Inc. And it stands now as one of the essential magazines both in print and online for the industry. He also runs his own very progressive conference each year in Northern California called Radio Convergence, which is all about looking forward, not back. He also has sports radio conferences, Hispanic and financial conferences for radio, and he recently purchased Radio TV Biz Report. And his company has a radio division and an art division, and 2 consumer magazines as well, and several online brands as well as his conferences. We're glad to have him here today, along with the architect of Rogers Radio, news stations across Canada. He is the VP of News for Rogers, John Hinnen. So please welcome Eric Rhoads and John Hinnen.
Thank you, Lee. Well, Eric, first of all, welcome to Toronto.
Thank you.
And welcome to the Lion's Den.
I noticed they were using my high school picture.
Well, I think that you had some interesting times in a week or two ago, and do you want to talk about what happened in the last couple of weeks that certainly has affected your life a little bit?
You know, it's really been a quiet week.
Well, obviously you made some news, and you retracted some of the comments that were made earlier, and I think people in this room know what we're talking about. But I want to at least give you a chance to talk about what happened last at that meeting, at the convergence meeting you had, and to explain exactly from your perspective how things evolved as they did.
Well, I was sitting in the audience at our convergence conference about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. And on the stage up here, we had a group of people talking about the digital dashboard. And there was a representative from the General Motors Digital Dashboard Division, someone from one of the consumer associations, someone from Gartner Research, and a couple other folks. And I was sitting right there, and the lady from General Motors made a statement, which is, no one listens to the kids don't listen to the radio anymore, and we're not really sure that we need to have radios in the car, and if we have them in the car, essentially they'll be able to get it through an aggregator like TuneIn or iHeart. And she didn't say that exactly, but I'm paraphrasing. So my blood started to boil, and then the guy from Gartner Research said, well, you know, the platforms are going to change, and the platforms are going to change very rapidly within the next couple of years. And you'll still be able to get radio, but he said AM radio will be taken off the dial, essentially. So I got up and I started questioning these people, and I couldn't get a commitment as to what car companies they were. And afterwards, I went back and I continued to badger them and try to find out what was going on. And I couldn't get a commitment, but what I was told is that it was 2 car companies within 2 years. Well, I wrote this fuming editorial about it, and essentially what occurred then is I should have checked my facts. First off, I didn't have the video at the moment, so I went and I did it from memory, and I also included what had happened off stage. And so I made a couple of statements. One is that radio would be off the dashboard within 5 years on all cars, and the other is that 2 car companies within 2 years. Well, I quite frankly didn't think much about it, and then the arrows started coming my way. And so I started hearing from everybody in the industry, and you know, that happens if I write something controversial. I'm kind of used to that. But then I got a call from a television reporter from NBC, and I thought, uh-oh, maybe I better just double check this. And so I called a friend of mine who owns a fairly significant advertising agency, and he said, Eric, I've been meaning to call you. I've been receiving calls from clients about whether or not they should drop radio. And I thought, uh-oh. And so I started looking into this, and I thought, you know, since people are panicking about what I wrote, I want to make sure that my facts are straight. So I called my video guy, I got the video, I transcribed the video, and of course there were people in the radio industry very upset about this as well. And my transcription, the essence of what I said was essentially true. The transcription of what was said was different than what I said. And I wanted to set the record straight because I didn't want to freak everybody out. My intent was to say, hey, this is coming. This will be something you're going to have to face down the road, whether it's now or in the future. And yes, I still believe a couple of car companies within a couple of years is what this man said to me. But on tape, he definitely said AM radio was being removed from the dash of a couple of car companies. He didn't say a couple of years. So essentially what I said was accurate, but he also said 5 to 10 years, and I wrote 5 years. So that's what caused the fury.
And the fallout from that has been somewhat good, and obviously it's also been negative from some perspective. But the unintended consequences are that the car manufacturers have come back, at least the large ones, and have committed to the fact that AM and FM will remain on the dashboard for the foreseeable future. So that's a positive, so that at least we can sleep better at night knowing that's going to be the case.
Well, one of the things that was said is I decided I needed to find out. Someone contacted me and said, look, you don't have two sources, and that's not journalistically accurate. I said, well, I was reporting what I heard at the conference, but if you want two sources, I'll go to the source. So I went to General Motors, and I was trying to find a contact and couldn't. So I used LinkedIn, found the person who's head of the digital dashboard, sent him a note, asked for a comment, and then I ended up getting a statement from General Motors that basically said they're committed to radio in the near term.
On your Facebook page, some of the folks who were commenting about what happened said that in some ways, one of the other unintended consequences is that this is a wake-up call maybe for the industry. Do you see that to be the case?
Absolutely. I think we're facing a change in our life. There's so many arrows that are coming at us in the radio industry. We have to make sure that we're paying attention to all of the things that are going on. Whether or not the AM, FM comes on or off the dash in the future is not as relevant as how people will be getting other forms of entertainment. If you look at the digital dashboard today, essentially the experience is pretty amazing. I got into somebody's car the other day, and it picked up on my cell phone and asked me if I wanted to incorporate it into the dash. If people are doing that, they're using their smartphone, if they're pressing Pandora on their dash or TuneIn or iHeart or other things, we have to be everywhere. And I think that's the ultimate signal is what do we as an industry do to make sure that we're everywhere? And of course it's hard to be everywhere and it's expensive to be everywhere, but you know, there are a lot of broadcasters who take the idea of I don't want to stream, I don't want anyone out of market who's listening, I don't want somebody listening in London if I'm in New York. But James Cridland and I were talking backstage, and one of the things he mentioned that's a real benefit, he's been involved with this technology that essentially if you're listening online and then you lose the online signal, it'll go to the radio signal or vice versa. And he was talking about how you could be listening to the radio station in London and lose the signal, and then the IP kicks in, and so you can drive, you know, for hundreds of miles and still listen to your favorite radio station in London. And the people at TuneIn, who I do some consulting work for, tell me that a very high percentage of the listenership of TuneIn listeners are actually in-market people who are traveling out of market. So you're still connected with your local listener. So I think the bottom line on all of this is that we have to embrace this technology. We have to be everywhere. We have to have good relationships with our consumers so that they seek out our brand. Because ultimately, if you're in an environment like TuneIn, which has 70,000 radio stations, and they go to the tuner for your market, I go into Austin, it shows all the Austin stations, shows all the San Antonio stations, and it shows all the local internet radio stations. I want to make sure that people are seeking my brand out. So that's all about the relationship with the listener.
And I think the consumer is the one that ultimately will make that decision, because one of the great things with AM and FM radio as it is today is the ease of use for people to be able to turn it on. And you know, it's certainly more difficult when you start dealing with iPads and things like that.
Well, you and I are not part of the digital generation. And the digital generation was born in 1989, and probably a number of you are in this room today, they think things through differently than we do, and they might be willing to jump through more hoops. I talked to Lou Dickey from Cumulus yesterday, and he said radio is as easy to use as a toaster, and that's true. But there are a lot of people who are of that digital generation who are going to use this in their smartphones or smartphones only or in a digital dash. So we just have to make sure that we're prepared for it.
One of your panelists talked about the fact that your convergence session, that things would be changing very quickly, and I was trying to figure out where that might have come from, and looked at the timing of your conference and then looked online to see if I could find a story that might have some impact on it. And I found one that ran on February 25th, which is just a few days prior to your conference, and this might have been the kind of thing that precipitated those comments, and that was a release from General Motors that it's going to outfit many of its 2015 vehicles with mobile high-speed internet through a built-in 4G LTE connection. The service will be available in both Canada and the United States, and the connection will allow eventually all GM drivers to turn their cars into Wi-Fi mobile hotspots and allow people to be able to stream video. I'm not sure I want people to streaming video in their cars, but nonetheless, that's an option I guess they're putting out there. At the end of the day, what's going to happen, I think, eventually is that even with AM and FM, in that dashboard, there'll be a lot more competition for radio to be able to find that space.
Well, there already is. So the new cars already have Pandora in the dash and TuneIn and iHeart. And a lot of these companies pay a lot of money to make sure that they're on that dash. So we're contending with that today. If you buy a new car today, and there are some car brands now that are delivered without any kind of a radio in them at all. One particular GM brand has no radio, and it ties strictly into the smartphone for younger people. So those are some facts. There are also some brands, for instance, a new Porsche, which is has no metal in the body, essentially. It's some kind of a graphite thing. It essentially cannot receive AM radio, so Porsche has delivered a car without AM radio in it. You probably have one
and Tesla has, of course, as the iPad as a configuration in the middle of their dash. You also have, I think, a bit of a video you want to show us about the Google car.
Yeah, essentially, we had Nolan Bushnell at our conference 2 years ago, and he talked about the Google car, and everybody's like rolling their eyes. I said, well, Nolan, I had dinner with him. I said, what's the impact on radio from your perspective as someone who knows nothing about radio? And he said, well, think about this. We listen to the radio in the car because we can multitask driving and listening to the radio. We can't really watch video. We can't really check our email effectively or text effectively, and that's why there's so many accidents. He said, but what if you don't have to drive the car? How does it change radio listening? Would you guys roll the video? This is from a TED conference. I'm not going to do any more setup, but guys, roll the video for a second.
Since our work is focused on building driving cars that can drive anywhere by themselves, any street in California, we've driven 140,000 miles. Our cars have sensors by which they magically can see everything around them and make decisions about every aspect of driving. It's the perfect driving mechanism. We've driven in cities, like in San Francisco here. We've driven from San Francisco to Los Angeles on Highway 1. We've encountered joggers, busy highways, toll booths. And this is without a person in the loop. The car just drives itself. In fact, while we drove 140,000 miles, people didn't even notice. Mountain roads, day and night, and even crooked Lombard Street in San Francisco.
Okay, you can kill the video.
Sometimes our cars get so crazy, they even do a little stunt.
So I think the essence of that, you need to understand that this seems like Buck Rogers and futuristic stuff, and it is, but the state of California has licensed these vehicles. The state of Florida has licensed these vehicles. The city of Las Vegas has said that within 5 years they're going to make all their taxi cabs driverless cars. The people on stage from General Motors said 10 to 15 years this will be fairly common. And what Bushnell said is there will be an insurance incentive. The insurance companies will want to push this because driverless cars mean no accidents. And the statistics bear it out. So how does that impact radio listening? Of course, nobody really knows, but if you can sit there and watch television or talk on the phone, then that may change things. I'm not saying this will happen, but I think that it's something that we think about as the impact of technology around us and the speed at which change is occurring is impacting every industry, every advertiser, the way everything is done.
You mentioned advertisers, and that's another subject I think we'd like to talk about a little bit. And that is that demand from some major advertisers now to make sure that every sale has an online component with it. And you had a session on that recently as well.
Yeah, we do a conference in New York called Forecast, and we had a panel of 4 men who represented most of the advertising billing in America, several $1 billion worth. And the panel basically said, you guys in the radio industry need to wake up because our advertisers are so enamored with the digital world that they want your digital relationship with your audience almost more than they want your broadcast relationship with your audience. And if you cannot offer us, when you're coming to us and selling us something, if you can't offer us a good digital offering, something to enhance the relationship with the audience, then we're not going to do business with you. And he said, by the way, he said, I'm embarrassed to tell you this. He said, we get pitches from the magazines and the television people and everything else. He said, I'm embarrassed because radio people come in here and they talk to us about banner ads. He said, banner ads, are so 1980s. And so you've got to be thinking about what kind of digital offer are you bringing the advertisers. The other thing that I think we have a problem with perception versus reality. Perception is, have you all seen that poster, the New Yorker's view of the world? It's New York is big and then everything else is little. Well, I think there should be a poster that says the Silicon Valley view of the world. And the Silicon Valley view of the world is everything should be digital. And if you talk to people in Silicon Valley, and I fought that battle for many years as the CEO of an online radio company, their world is everything should be digital, everything should be IP. Why on earth would you want this 100-year-old technology, this broad casting technology, when you can accomplish everything one-on-one with digital? And of course, there's a lot of truth to that. But that truth didn't that truth didn't hold true during Hurricane Sandy, when the power went down, when the wireless went out, when the cell towers went down. Radio was the only form of communication. Television wasn't even able to communicate because nobody, of course, has portable televisions that are battery operated. Cell phones die. Once the charge goes out and you can't recharge it, people were going out and listening to their car radios to find out what was going on in their community. This is something that we need to reiterate. Now, clearly IP is taking over the world, and clearly digital is taking over the world, and we need to be focusing on that. But advertisers are enamored with digital, so we have to focus on that. The other thing that is a perception versus reality thing is that I have a neighbor who is a national brand manager for a national ad agency in Austin, and he was the head of a car running the advertising for one of the major national car companies. And I asked him, what's the biggest challenge that you face in the agency? And he said, the challenge I face is that for this particular car brand, who I can't mention, he said 50% of the people who own the dealerships around the country have turned these dealerships over to their kids to run. They're at retirement age. They don't want to work so hard anymore. They want to get their kids experience, so they've put their kids into the business. He said 50% of them are running these businesses are 25 to 35-year-olds. And he said, they're coming to us and saying, we don't want to do television, we don't want to do print, we don't want to do magazines, we don't want to do radio, we want everything to be digital. We want to do social media, we want to do Facebook. And they're like, yeah, but we don't have evidence that that stuff works. We know the other traditional media work, and these people won't let them do it. So what we're facing is we've got to figure out how to communicate our strength, our value, our numbers. The people in the convergence panel at Silicon Valley a couple of weeks ago were talking about their research that said, we don't believe young people use radio anymore. Well, in America, according to Arbitron, we're growing with young people. Young people are using the radio. Now, whether that's an Arbitron problem or not, I can't really tell, but we have to figure out how to make these people understand that radio isn't dying. I was watching CNN yesterday, and there was some new startup on, and he was talking about how he was going to grab all these ad dollars. And he said because traditional media is dying, and he mentioned radio in that. Well, the reality is radio isn't dying. But the perception is because it's traditional media, it is. So we have to change the perception problem.
And I think we probably need to make sure that as part of that, changing that perception, we advise people that radio really is the one source, as you mentioned earlier, when it comes to health and safety in emergencies, that the radio is the one source you can get there. If the internet goes down, you can't get that information out there. Another reason to have AM and FM radio in your cars.
Yeah, and I think the other thing we have to think about here is how people use the radio today and what we've done to drive them away. In America, the situation is much different than it is here. In America, we have these giant corporations who own thousands or hundreds of radio stations, maybe thousands in one case, and 6 or 8 radio stations in a particular marketplace. And because their cost structure, their debt is so high, they're cutting things out and they're going national. You'll see a Ryan Seacrest across 200 markets. You're going to see a lot more of that. And we in the radio industry, and I'm part of the problem back in the 70s when I was on the air, we were doing, music-free or commercial-free Sundays and commercial-free hours, and we demonized commercials, and we were all about playing more music. Well, back then it made more sense, but now what we've done is we've kind of paved the way for a Pandora who comes out and says, hey, we really don't have much or any commercials, maybe one per hour, and when I listen, I hardly ever hear one. And yet they're doing, I think they're projecting $600 million in revenue against Cumulus's just over $1 billion in revenue. That's pretty good for a startup that doesn't have any transmitters.
Your comment about demonizing commercials, that's something that certainly radio has done for years, as you say, with commercial-free Sundays and things like that. How do we get around that? Because commercials are certainly an important part of what we do in terms of financing our operation. So do we need to change the philosophy on that front, or what are you thinking?
I don't have any idea, but I would guess that I think what we're up against is, I don't know what your commercial loads are like here in Canada, but in America we're running on some of our radio stations 20 minutes of commercials. We're running huge stop sets that have 7, 8, 9, 10 commercials in a stop set. And quite frankly, as a listener, it's annoying. And so I think if we're in a music radio environment, we have to be realistic and be willing to knock that back. Back in the days, when I was in a music radio station, we got in a lot of hot water from going from 7 minutes of commercials to 7.5 minutes of commercials. And so now today, a lot of music radio stations are running a lot more than that. I'm not so sure the research bears out that that's a problem, but if we get into a comparison situation with us versus a Pandora, that certainly gives them a strength. I think what radio has to focus on is the content of what we can provide that Pandora or others can't provide. And I think that boils down to localism, personality, entertainment. There are people who want to just listen to music, but there are also people like me who want to be connected with the community. I listen to a local radio station because I want to know what there is to do this weekend. Where can I take my kids? What should I be paying attention to? That's what radio has to strengthen, is to really play off of its ability to localize, to entertain. Clear Channel is kind of taking an approach of entertainment. They're taking big national talent like Seacrest and saying, well, that's really no different than Jay Leno on the networks for television. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. And that, somebody who's got a lot of talent like Ryan Seacrest might be able to get more listeners than some local talent. But if you're really focusing on being local, about talking about your community, I think that's where your strength lies. And if you have that deep one-on-one relationship with your listener, they will seek you out in that digital environment where they have a choice of 70,000 stations on their car dash.
Besides radio, your other passion, of course, is art. You always, if people follow you on Twitter, they see probably more tweets on art than they do even on radio. And your reason for getting into art is really as a way to look at life from a different perspective. Is that what it was?
Well, I've been doing radio for 40 plus years, and I love radio, but I realized I had become a very one-dimensional person. I'm very curious, and I want to know about other things, and so I felt like I needed something to get away from my very busy life. You guys are probably the same. You know, you wake up in the morning, the first thing you do is check your email. The last thing you do at night is check your email. While you're sitting there watching television or doing something else, you're checking your email. I just decided I was becoming a very boring person, and I wanted something to get me excited, to get me away from it. So I started painting. You know, I'm an amateur. You know, my work's in a couple of art galleries now, but I'm really an amateur. But I took that passion for art and turned it into some art magazines. So we have a whole separate division that does consumer art magazines and art conferences and things like that.
Now, one of the new books that's out right now is by Seth Godin, and in it he talks a lot about art and the fact that everything we do in life is art, and that as broadcasters, I take away from that we really need to be artists, become artists as well. Do you think that the broadcast industry has taken that to heart, and are we artists, or is it it's general? It's a very general comment, of course, because there's some real great broadcasters out there. What kind of things can we do from an art perspective to make radio even better?
Well, I think starting out by really talking to your listeners and finding out, you know, living around your listeners, finding out what your listeners want. It's one thing to do research, and we all do a lot of it, and you have to do research, but you also need to connect with people one-on-one and make sure that you're having a true understanding about what they need in their lives, because their lives are changing, the way they're consuming media is changing, and we need to be reflecting that. We need to be talking about the things that are important in their lives. But I think, you know, there are a lot of great craftspeople in the radio broadcasting industry, and you're very fortunate in Canada that you have this situation that you have where you're allowed to be craftspeople. In America, one of the big problems that we have thousands of unemployed, talented DJs who were making too much money, and so they got cut out of the loop. They have nowhere to go. Now, some of them are starting their own online radio brands. Some of the national talent who aren't on syndicated radio anymore are starting their own online things. Some of them are making some money. So that may be a future. But I think everything needs to be about craft first. I believe, you know, I'm very much a capitalist. I believe in making money. But I also think if you put the money first, then it will show. And I think you have to put the craft first. And we try to do that in our businesses. Good content is what it's all about. And good craftspeople, good professionals do good content. So start with the content. And I think that to some extent the money will follow. You have to chase it. You have to do certain things to create that environment. And I'm not saying don't chase money, but I think you really need to make sure that content rules your broadcast.
One of the things we thought we'd do here this morning is that in light of the fact that Eric obviously caused a stir in the last couple of weeks, that give all of you a chance as well. If you have a question or two, he's prepared to take those and certainly be on the hot seat. And so if anyone has a question, I believe we have someone around with a microphone. If I'm not mistaken, there, she's right there. There's a couple of hands on the far side. Oh, okay.
Be gentle. We intentionally turned your microphone off.
Thank you. Eric, first of all, thank you for bringing attention to a very serious matter. Whether that article, you know, got you in lots of heck or whatever, I think it did succeed in bringing a lot of attention to a very important matter for broadcasters. And if I remember, the end of your article, you gave some suggestions as to what the industry should do. And one of the things was to lobby government and to make sure this doesn't happen. Are you aware that whether it's the NAB or the RAB, or is there any efforts in the States to talk to your local congressman or to Washington about making sure live terrestrial radio stays vibrant in the automobile?
Well, first I would say that I thank you for that compliment. I'm not a real big fan of getting the government involved in everything. I'd much rather have the marketplace make decisions about these things. I think first and foremost, we need to make sure that consumers are aware that this is a possibility, and we have a delicate balance because we don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot at the same time, but we have to make sure that we're cementing that consumer relationship and making sure that consumers are insisting on a car radio that has their AM and their FM on it. Because of the editorial, there have been some discussions, I'm told, behind the scenes at certain organizations that perhaps might be opening up the door to some kind of regulation. I do know that the FCC commissioner saw the editorial, and his off-the-record reaction was very positive for broadcasters. So I think that's a good thing. And whether or not that results in some form of legislative activity, I don't know. I want to mention one thing because it prompted something else, and that was that one of the panelists on that session was telling a story about how a woman went to a car dealer and was about to buy a car, and she said she was telling the story about how she asked the salesperson if the car had Pandora on it or not. And the car she wanted to buy did not have it, so she selected a different car just because of Pandora on the dash. I think that says a lot about people's personal commitment to radio, and I think if consumers go and they say, well, can I listen to my local radio station on this? I don't think people will ask. You know, we always assume a radio is in a car. A car is a radio on wheels. And so if someone buys a car and gets in it and drives it and realizes they can't find their local radio station, my guess is they're going to bring it back. Other questions?
Over there as well.
Yeah, you talk a bit about the digital dashboard in the car. We've heard through the broadcast industry, HD radio, high-density radio. Is there a place in the industry for that on the dashboard?
Oh, absolutely. There's a place for it. Some of the cars now, it's kind of a seamless experience. It's not that you have a separate HD button. You're just going across the dial and you're encountering the HD stations. And so the consumer doesn't really necessarily know they're on HD or not on HD. You know, whether or not they can tell a difference, quite frankly, I don't know. I think the big issue, most of the car companies seem to be committed to HD radio. The problem with HD radio is that it doesn't necessarily include AM radio. And it also has a tendency to have, you know, HD radio is being used in, I think, roughly, I don't know the number, maybe 1,200 radio stations, maybe it's more than that. But a lot of the smaller markets, a lot of the rural markets have not committed to it. It's been the bigger companies like Clear Channel who committed to it and spent a lot of money on it. And so it will push HD radio further if that's the only way you end up getting it on the dash. I believe that, you know, the broadcasters everywhere in America will have to use it. What that means to your car radio if you're driving across the border, I don't know the answer to that.
Was there a question on this side? I thought I saw a hand up over here. Maybe not. One of the other things I feel that we need to think about is, and one of the real issues you brought up was the information that was brought to your conference that kids don't listen to radio. It's my view that the consumer at the end of the day will make the decision whether or not we have AM and FM in the dash or not, or whatever changes are made to radio overall. But if the consumer information that's getting back to the automotive companies is incorrect, and quite frankly, I can't see how it would be right, should the broadcasting industry as an entity do more research and make sure that they share that information with, which quite frankly should be their partners in the auto industry?
Absolutely. I think there's two issues. The woman from one of the car companies said that it was MTV Scratch, which is a youth culture consulting firm, had led them to the belief that young people don't use radio in the way that baby boomers use radio. And I am a little confused whether or not there was actually a research study or if this is just an assumption. You know, again, it might be that Silicon Valley view of the world. On stage, I encouraged them to make sure they did deep studies about true radio usage from consumers, because for their own good, quite frankly, they're not going to pull a radio out of the car if they think consumers will not buy that car if there's no radio. They want people to buy cars. Their big issue right now is the young people are not buying cars, and they're trying to come up with something that's going to get them excited about the car radio, or about the car, which kind of is about that infotainment system in the car. So ultimately, yeah, we need to be communicating. We need this. I told the CEO of one of the big groups the other day, you need to get face-to-face with the car manufacturers the CEO to CEO level, and you need to share with them the research that shows that young people, in fact, do listen to the radio. And if they don't believe it, then we need to together undertake some kind of a massive research study, because we're under constant threat. We have Twitter announced this week that, or last week, that they're coming out with a music service. We know Google, YouTube is coming out with a music service, and there's a rumor that Apple is going to be launching Apple Radio. And of course, typically when Apple does something, they do it well, and they have 200 million credit cards. They're going to figure out a way to make it successful. We're constantly under attack. Everybody wants what we have, and that's that relationship with the listener and the ability to drive advertising to that listener, or maybe not drive advertising, but gain income from them. So we have, as an industry, a responsibility to be able to effectively promote what we have. I don't like us being on the defensive, because it makes us look like we're defending buggy whips. But I think we need, I told one of the CEOs yesterday of one of the big groups, we need a $10 million war chest and a PR firm that's going to be able to compete with the PR firm that Pandora is using or Apple is using, because these people are coming after radio, and we need to understand they're trying to take our listeners. Will it be an either-or proposition? So far, there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence that people are not necessarily taking, their radio listening and using it for other things. They seem to be adding on, but at some point it might be. So we need to make sure that we have the right war chest.
Great. I was going to ask you for one tip, but that sounds like a very good tip to end on. Eric, thank you very much. I know that when one's under the hot seat, and you're actually on the white seat right now, but nonetheless on the hot seat, you can sometimes fade away and try and hide. And I applaud you for being here and confronting these issues, and for being a friend of radio. So thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.